the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others.
Yellowstone's ecological turnaround gets called one of the greatest conservation success stories ever told, and it earned that title. On January 12, 1995, a steel door slid open in the Lamar Valley, and a single wolf stepped onto ground his kind had not touched in almost 70 years.
Life is constructed in kind of like a triangle, where you have very few species at the top and a lot of species at the bottom, and wolves sit at the top.
What happened next brought a dying landscape back to life. But the version of that story you have heard, the one in every documentary, is, according to the scientists who actually went out and measured it, about half wrong. And the truth is bigger, stranger, and far more remarkable than the legend. Here is what really happened. The quiet collapse. By the early 1990s, the streams of Yellowstone's northern range were dying in slow motion. The willows along Soda Butte Creek had been chewed down to woody stubs for 3 generations straight. Aspen stands that had stood for a century were not producing a single sapling that survived past knee height. Beaver colonies, which the park had once counted in the dozens, were down to a single known lodge, and the elk herd that had eaten its way through all of it numbered close to 19,000 animals, standing on ground that should have held maybe half that. Here is the thing about this kind of collapse. It was not dramatic. Nothing burned, nothing flooded. The park was not falling apart in any way a visitor driving through would have noticed from the road. It was collapsing quietly, one missing sapling at a time, and it had been doing exactly that for almost 70 years. To understand why what came next mattered so much, you first have to understand what Yellowstone had quietly become. Go back to the early 1920s. Federal predator control had been working its way through the park with rifles and poison, and by then it had killed off the last known wolf pack inside the boundary. This was not an accident or a side effect. It was the deliberate policy of the day, carried out by the government's own men in the country's first national park, in the full belief that they were improving it. Wolves were vermin. Cougars were vermin. Anything that ate the animals tourists came to photograph was a problem to be solved with rifles and strychnine. By 1926, the solving was finished. The last pack was gone, and the silence settled in. For the next 7 decades, the largest predator left in the entire ecosystem was the grizzly bear. And here is what most people get wrong about that. Bears do not hunt the way wolves hunt. Bears scavenge. They dig. They fish. They will take a calf if one stumbles across their path in spring. But a bear does not run a healthy adult elk down across open ground in deep snow the way a wolf pack does, hour after hour, testing the herd, picking off the one animal that cannot keep up. That relentless selective pressure is what shapes how a herd behaves, where it goes, how long it dares to linger in one spot. There is no substitute for that kind of pressure, and for 70 years, there was nothing in the system applying it. So the elk did exactly what unpressured herbivores always do. They multiplied, and they stopped moving. And that second part is the one that quietly did the damage. A herd that moves through a landscape gives the plants a chance to recover between visits. A herd that settles in and stays never lets anything grow back up past its mouth. Nothing was chasing them off the soft, easy ground by the water, so they never left it. By the late 1980s, the northern range elk herd was estimated somewhere between 16 and 19,000 animals on a piece of ground that paleoecologists believe historically supported roughly half that number. They stood in the same meadows for weeks at a stretch. They browsed the same willow stems down to woody stubs. They walked straight into the riparian zones, the green ribbons of vegetation that run along the streams, and they did not leave, because nothing on earth was making them leave. The willows, the aspens, the cottonwoods along the creeks of the northern range were not regenerating at all. And we know this with real precision because researchers had the photographs to prove it. Pictures taken from the same surveyed points in the 1930s and again in the 1980s told the identical story across 2 frames. Young trees in the old picture, bare gravel and stripped shrubs in the new one. Stand in front of those 2 images side by side, and you are looking at 50 years of loss with nothing in between to soften it. An entire generation of riparian forest had simply gone missing. For 70 years, the northern range was a grave with the lid left open. Everything that should have been growing there was just absent, and nothing ever arrived to close it. That is the Yellowstone that was about to get a visitor. One steel door. On January 12, 1995, a National Park Service truck backed up to a chain-link pen in the Lamar Valley, and that steel door slid open. The wolf stepped out into the snow. He was the first of his species to set foot on that ground, since federal hunters had killed off the last pack almost 70 years before. And he was not alone for long. Within 10 weeks, 13 more were loose on the landscape. 12 months after that, 17 more arrived, this batch from British Columbia. By the time the releases were done, 31 founding animals had been captured up in Alberta and British Columbia and turned loose into a park that had not contained a single wolf in living memory. 31 animals, across an ecosystem that sprawls over millions of acres of mountain and river valley and high plateau. On paper, it sounds almost laughably small, a rounding error against all that country. And that is part of what makes the next part so hard for people to believe. And then, the park started to change. 10 years later, the willows along Soda Butte were taller than a man standing among them. Beaver colonies on the northern range had climbed from 1 to 9. Songbirds that nest in the riparian thickets were turning up in counts no one had recorded in decades. Aspen seedlings were surviving their first winter for the first time in the working lifetime of anyone in the park. Researchers who had spent careers watching the place wither were now watching it do something they had nearly stopped expecting to see. It was growing back. That is the famous version of the story. The wolves came home, and the whole system healed itself. It is clean. It is beautiful. It fits in a single sentence. It is also, as the very scientists who measured it would later admit, about half wrong. And before I show you where it goes wrong, I want to be straight with you about why that matters, because it is the whole reason this channel exists. We tell these stories the way the science actually tells them, not the way they fit best on a poster. The back half of this video is where the famous version cracks wide open, and the real story underneath it is stranger and, honestly, better. If that is the kind of story you came for, take 1 second and subscribe, because this is exactly where it cracks open. The famous version. On the posters, it is simple. 14 animals walked into a valley, and within 10 years, they had changed the shape of the rivers. Here is how that version goes in full, because you have almost certainly absorbed pieces of it without ever knowing where they came from. The first decade after the release moved faster than the biologists expected. Within 3 years, the wolves had organized themselves into packs and were killing elk at rates that surprised even the people who had fought for the reintroduction. Doug Smith, the biologist who has run the Yellowstone Wolf Project from the very beginning, has said in interviews that the early kill rates came in higher than the modeling had predicted. The wolves took primarily old, weak, and winter-stressed elk, exactly the way wolves are supposed to. But they took a lot of them. The elk herd began to fall, and it fell hard. By the mid-2000s, the northern range count had dropped from its late 1980s peak down to roughly 6,000 to 8,000 animals. Depending on which year you choose as your baseline, that is a reduction of somewhere between half and 2/3 of the entire herd. And then, in places along the streams, something started growing back. Cameras began capturing willow stems standing above browse height for the first time in living memory. Beavers, which need willow to build with and to eat through the long winter, recolonized streams they had abandoned years before. Beaver colonies on the northern range went from 1 in 1996 to 9 by 2009. A small number in absolute terms, an enormous one in proportion. Songbirds that nest in willow thickets came back. Trout populations in some reaches improved as the new shade cooled the water down. In 2003, 2 ecologists named William Ripple and Robert Beshta, both at Oregon State University, published the first of what would become a whole series of papers proposing a name for what they were watching. They called it a trophic cascade, and the idea is genuinely elegant. The wolves were not just killing elk, they were changing where elk dared to stand. Elk started avoiding the narrow stream corridors, the places where an ambush is easy and an escape is hard. That avoidance lifted the browsing pressure off the willows. The willows came back. The willows brought back the beavers. The beavers built dams. The dams stored water, raised the water table, slowed the spring runoff, cooled the streams, and in Ripple and Beshta's framing, they changed the very shape of Yellowstone's rivers. It was the cleanest, most cinematic ecological story of the modern era, and the world swallowed it whole. And you can see why. It gave people something almost nobody expects from environmental news, which is hope with a clear mechanism attached. Not just that nature is fragile, but that one right move could set the whole thing healing on its own. It became a TED Talk. It became a viral short film narrated by a British journalist with a voice like a warm blanket. It became the line you have heard repeated 1,000 times. The wolves change the rivers. That line is not exactly true. And the people who first measured the cascade were among the very first to say so. Half wrong. Starting in the early part of the decade that began in 2010, a different group of ecologists began publishing work that complicated the picture in a serious way. Matthew Kaufman at the University of Wyoming, Kristen Marshall, also at Wyoming and later at NOAA, and a research team led by Tom Hobbs at Colorado State University. These people walked into the exact same valleys the famous story had come out of, but they walked in carrying different questions. They were not trying to prove that wolves did not matter. Nobody serious thought that. What they were trying to figure out was how much of what everyone was seeing was actually the wolves, and how much of it was something else entirely, wearing the wolves' credit, and several things turned up. The elk decline was never driven by wolves alone. A severe drought hit the region in the early 2000s and cut down the available forage, which means a lot of those animals were going into winter already thin. Grizzly bears, whose population had recovered substantially across those same decades, were killing elk calves at rates that, added up across the whole northern range, removed thousands of animals every single year. Cougar populations had quietly climbed back up too, hunting the same herd from the cover of the timber, and hunters outside the park, drawing from a herd that migrated across the boundary every winter, were taking large numbers of their own. So the wolves were one pressure among several. Subtract any single one of them, the drought, the bears, the cougars, the hunters, the wolves, and the herd would still have fallen. Maybe more slowly, but it would have fallen. Then there was the willow recovery itself, and it was patchy. Genuinely, stubbornly patchy. In some valleys, most famously along parts of Soda Butte Creek, the willows came roaring back tall and dense, exactly the way the Cascade story predicts. But in other places, sometimes just a few miles away, the willows stayed short and chewed down, even after the elk numbers had collapsed. Same park, same wolves overhead, same crashed elk herd, and yet, one stretch of creek recovered while the next one over did not. The pressure was gone, and they still would not grow. To understand why, picture Tom Hobbs down in one of those channels, not citing a paper, but standing in the stream bed itself, boots in the gravel, walking a creek that had cut so deep into its own banks that the water now ran a meter or more below where it used to. He is measuring, with his own instruments, how far the water table has fallen beneath the roots of a young willow. And the gap he is measuring is the whole problem, because that was the answer. And it had nothing to do with elk being afraid. Over 70 years without beavers, the streams had been quietly cutting down into their own beds. Without beaver dams to slow the water and spread it across the floodplain, the channels eroded deeper and deeper, a process called incision. And as those channels dropped, the water table dropped right along with them until it fell below the root zone of a young willow. You could remove every last elk in the valley and the willows still could not grow because their roots could no longer reach the water. So to fix it, you needed beavers to dam the streams back up and lift the water table. But to get beavers, you needed enough willow for them to start with. And to grow that first stand of willow in a lot of places, you needed direct human intervention, small dam structures built by hand, willow cuttings planted into the bank. Not the distant threat of a wolf up on the ridge, but an actual person with a shovel and a plan. In the clean telling, the wolf is the cause and everything downstream is the effect, one falling domino knocking over the next. But on these reaches, the dominoes had been glued to the floor decades earlier. And yet, even after all of that, there was still one claim sitting right at the heart of the famous story that nobody had actually gone out and put to the test. The single most cinematic claim of them all. The one about fear. The tangled web. The idea was that the elk had become too terrified of wolves to stand anywhere near the streams. The landscape of fear. Predators do not only kill prey, they frighten it. and frightened prey changes its behavior in ways that ripple outward across the land. For Yellowstone, the specific claim was that elk had abandoned the riparian zones entirely, because that is exactly where wolves could corner them. So, researchers went and tested it directly. They strapped GPS collars onto elk. They sat in the field and watched season after season. And what they found did not match the story. The elk did not, in fact, dramatically change where they grazed in response to wolves being around. What they changed was far more subtle. They changed when they grazed. They changed how vigilantly they grazed, heads up and scanning the tree line instead of down, and relaxed. They changed how tightly they bunched together. Real responses, all of them. The kind any animal makes when something that can kill it moves back into the neighborhood. But they are not the same thing as a herd abandoning the streams. The elk were still there, in the willows, along the water. They were just nervous about it, and that distinction matters because the whole tidy cascade rested on the stronger claim. The dramatic picture, the one where the elk simply vacated the stream corridors out of raw fear, that picture is not what the collars showed. By the late 2000s, the scientific consensus inside the Yellowstone research community had shifted to something less tidy, but a great deal more honest. Had the wolves triggered a cascade? Yes. Genuinely, measurably, yes. The wolves mattered, and they mattered a great deal. But that cascade ran through a tangled web of drought, bears, cougars, hunters, hydrology, and aspen biology. It was not a single elegant chain running straight from predator to river. It was a dozen forces pushing and pulling at once, with the wolves as one strong hand among several, not the lone hand on the lever. In a 2018 review, Kaufman and his co-authors put it about as plainly as scientists ever put anything. The original story they wrote had been a useful hypothesis that the data had since complicated. And Ripple and Beshta, to their real credit, kept right on publishing updated work too, acknowledging the role of all those other factors while still arguing that the wolves remained a meaningful driver of what happened. That dispute is real, and it is still active today. This is not a case of one side getting exposed as flatly wrong. It is a case of a simple story growing up into a complicated one, in public, over 30 years. Which leaves us with the only question that really matters. What actually happened? If the famous version is half wrong, then what is actually true about what happened in Yellowstone between 1995 and 2025? The honest answer is that something genuinely large took place out there. It was just bigger than wolves alone. The northern range today is not the place it was in 1994, not even close. Beaver colonies are an order of magnitude more common than they were at the low point, which means the engineers are back on the streams, building the very structures that hold water on the land. Cottonwood and aspen regeneration, after stalling out for literal decades, is now happening in measurable patches. Uneven, contested, argued over in journals, but real. Songbird diversity along the recovering willow corridors is higher than it was during the elk peak. The elk herd itself has stabilized at a level much closer to what the ecosystem actually appears able to sustain, instead of overshooting it and crashing through the bottom the way it did before. The herd is healthier now precisely because there is something out there keeping it honest. And then there are the effects almost nobody bothers to talk about. The ones that never made the documentary because they do not fit the willows and rivers arc. Coyotes had become the de facto top predator while the wolves were gone, and they had multiplied into that empty role. After the reintroduction, coyote numbers were cut by roughly half in the early years, and that gave foxes, pronghorn fawns, and ground-nesting birds a kind of breathing room they had not had in 70 years. A whole layer of smaller animals got to exist again because the thing that had been eating them was suddenly being kept in check. And the carcasses the wolves leave behind now feed ravens, eagles, magpies, wolverines, and bears straight through the heart of winter. In a way the ecosystem had simply been missing the whole time. A single wolf kill in deep snow becomes a table that a dozen other species sit down at. None of that is a fairy tale. All of it sits in the long-term monitoring data from the National Park Service, the Yellowstone Wolf Project, and a dozen affiliated universities. It is measured, it is documented, it is real. What the wolves did not do was rewrite Yellowstone all by themselves. What they did was act as the last missing piece of a system that had been running for 70 years with one critical part torn out of it. And the system did not snap back to 1872. That is the part you have to hold on to. It moved in a direction. It moved fast in some places and not at all in others. And in the very act of moving, it revealed exactly how much of the damage was structural, baked so deep into the shape of the land that no animal could chew or hunt its way back out. The incised channels, the lost beaver wetlands, the drought-altered forage, damage that no predator, no matter how many of them you release into a valley, can undo on its own. One willow stem. There is a photograph the biologists at the Wolf Project sometimes show at the very end of their public talks. And it is not a photo of a wolf, it is a photo of a single willow stem on Slough Creek, photographed once in 1997, and then again from the exact same spot in 2012. In the first frame, the stem is about the height of a man's knee, browsed flat, dying. In the second frame, that same willow is 12 feet tall and flowering. Now, that one willow is not the whole story of Yellowstone. It is one stem on one creek in one enormous park. But here is the smallest true version of everything I have told you tonight. 14 wolves walked into a valley in January of 1995, and somewhere upstream of that willow, an elk that would otherwise have eaten it down to nothing chose, for whatever tangled combination of reasons we will never fully untangle, to stand somewhere else. That is it. That is the smallest possible version of what happened here. And it happens to be the only version that absolutely no one disputes. The cascade was messier than the headline promised. The recovery was slower and far less complete than the documentary made it sound. But the valley that received those first animals in January of 1995 is genuinely not the valley that exists out there now. And the difference between those two valleys, whatever else you choose to call it, is the difference between an ecosystem missing a piece of itself and an ecosystem that has finally got it back. So, if this story changed how you think about Yellowstone, or honestly about every other miracle recovery you have ever heard described, with that same clean little arrow running straight from cause to effect, do me a favor and leave a comment. Tell me which part landed hardest for you. The 14 wolves, the half-wrong famous story, or that single willow stem on Slough Creek that somehow says more than any headline ever could. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the channel for it. We tell these stories the way the science actually tells them, mess and all. I'll see you in the next one.